All righty. We are just waiting for Facebook Live to get set up. I'm sure the folks at Facebook had an interesting day today.
I don't know. Actually, I don't know that it was that interesting.
That's fair. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I am
Okay.
so thrilled to be on with Blair Levin, who has an extensive background in the digital divide, starting with being a chief of staff to an FCC chairman, advising Wall Street on how to think about broadband, and then leading the national broadband plan, and currently doing a lot of research for the Brookings Institute. So thanks so much for joining No One Left Offline tonight, Blair. It's an honor to have you.
It's an honor to be here.
Well, so one question we're starting off for everyone
Yeah.
is, why do you care about the digital divide? Did you grow up caring about internet? What was it that sparked you to get involved with this?
I'm way too old to have grown up caring about the internet. Uh, no, look, I think we all come to it in different ways. I come out of a family that, with a father who was a lawyer, but very involved in the 60s in both kind of liberal democratic politics, as well as the various things related to civil rights, fair housing, things like that. At every point in time, I think there are, you have to think about what is the thing that matters at this moment. Martin Luther King wrote a wonderful book in which he kind of laid out, we have a choice of chaos or community. And I think about that a lot. And the question is, what are the things that create a greater sense of solidarity, create social cohesion, create community? When you look at the episodes in history where there's been chaos, those have not been fun episodes to live in. Where you see strong communities, generally life is much better. Even if it's poorer, it's generally much better. So, when I came to the FCC, the internet hadn't yet been invented. It was invented shortly thereafter. And it was pretty clear early on that it was a tool that one could be hopeful that it would create community. The most famous metaphor of that time was Al Gore talking about how it would connect the child in Carthage, Tennessee to the Library of Congress. And so I think that drove a lot of our hope. I was very involved in the 96 Act and then in the implementation of the 96 Act with the E-rate, something you'll be talking to Evan Marwell on Friday. Evan probably did more as a single individual to realize the promise of the E-rate than anyone else, but I'll let him tell his own story. But a wonderful, wonderful person. In any event, so I certainly started caring about it in that process. But it really goes to the larger point that one should hope that the internet is something that builds economic progress and resiliency, as well as social cohesion and progress.
Right. And I think we could have a whole another conversation about some of the chaotic elements that the internet can inspire. But I think
that's actually right. And I would just note, when we did the National Broadband Plan, it was at 2009 and 10. Generally, the view was this is all going to be great. We just need to make it greater. What are the incentives we need to do? Today, there was a hearing about the market dominance of tech, but there are lots of other issues: content moderation, privacy, cybersecurity. So, the kind of utopian vision was obviously naive in some ways. But as a hope, we should aspire to do better with it.
Very much so. And so when it comes to those communities and that idea of community, I know one big issue we have is just knowing which communities are served, as well as in those communities, who's accessing the internet, even if there is deployment in those communities. So for the perhaps uninitiated, can you kind of just outline the difference between deployment and access?
Well, I would use the word access and adoption. So I think, and look, we were about the 35th country to do a national broadband plan. There have been about 155 in total now done. all of them touch on one, two, or three things. We touched on all three. Step one, how do you get networks everywhere? Step two, how do you get everybody on them? Step three, how do you utilize networks and that connectivity to improve the delivery of essential services, healthcare, education, job training, civic engagement, etc. So I think of the first as being access. That is at this point largely a rural problem. It was not largely a rural problem when the internet started. So we've gone through various iterations. When the phrase digital divide was invented in the late 90s, it applied to cities as much as it did rural areas. But now it's largely a rural phenomenon. So we have to finish the job of getting adequate networks everywhere. But that raises the question of what is an adequate network. So we can chat about that. Then you have the question of adoption. And there too, you not only have to track it, and I should have mentioned that as a country, we've done a bad job of mapping where the networks are. We've also done a bad job of calibrating who's on and who's not. But adoption is a tricky thing. There are some studies that suggest it's almost all about affordability. There are other studies that suggest even at zero price, there are lots of people who won't go on. We can chat about that. There seem to be three issues that keep people off. One is affordability, a second is relevance, and the third is digital literacy. There are some other issues like concerns about privacy and security. But those are all related issues, and you have to have strategies to address them all. And then finally, and what I think is really going to be the challenge of this decade, I think we can solve the first two relatively soon if we put our minds to it. But the third is really where the upside is. And I think that 10 years from now, we'll look back and say the biggest digital divide that existed in 2020 was actually the difference between what we could have been doing and what we were doing. And I would just note, COVID is horrible and painful, and it has caused huge pain. But one of the things it has done, as the CEO of Microsoft noted, we made 2 years of progress in terms of using digital networks in 2 months.
Wow.
And so whether it be what we're doing now or a Zoom Seder, which allowed me to have Passover Seder with my mom and my siblings who are on the West Coast, and it wasn't as great as being together, but it was interesting. There are lots of things we could have been doing all along. We weren't doing them, and now we have to. Telehealth, there's been huge progress. By the way, the National Broadband Plan, I think it was the only federal document in 2010 that warned about a pandemic.
Wow.
Now, we didn't warn about it in the way that scientists did. We just said, look, if there's a pandemic, we're going to need a lot of telehealth. And we need it anyway. And we went through what we thought was necessary, but the pandemic was one of the things on our radar.
Right. Deb yesterday talked a lot about how encouraging it was. Obviously, she was dismayed that it took a pandemic for this conversation to really move to the forefront, but talking about, in her words, she was used to going to a conference and being the Friday at 5 o'clock panelist competing with happy hour. And now she's the first person folks call. So just getting that sense of urgency. And I wonder, do you think, looking at what's going on in DC right now, are you optimistic that DC will rise to meet the moment? Or do you think it's better to kind of focus our energy and efforts on local and state actors?
Oh, gosh.
It's a softball.
Yeah, no, yeah. But it's, I don't want to get into partisan politics, but it won't fool anyone who knows me knows I worked for the Clinton administration, knows I worked in the Obama administration, is likely to guess who I'm for in this election, and they would be right. I am not optimistic if Trump is reelected. Now, I think Trump and the people in telecom policy care a lot about the rural digital divide. Right. That is, and they've spent a lot of time and money on it. Whether they've been successful or not, we could argue about. But I do think they sincerely care about that. And they have funneled a lot of money on it. And a lot of that was, frankly, based on a lot of things we did in the National Broadband Plan. So I don't want to be critical of that. They have been, I think, not at all good on the adoption front and not at all good on the utilization front. So I think there needs to be a change for the federal government to operate. But you know, I would go with, I mean, I had a lot of disagreements with my friends during the Bush administration, but I did think that they had the interest of the country at heart, and they were competent people, and they were doing the best as I understood it. I don't see that same devotion to actual policy in the Trump administration, and I could give you a lot of examples of that, but the most obvious one is COVID, where after 150,000 people dead and 4 million cases, we don't have a national strategy, you don't have national testing. And I know we're here to talk about broadband, but the way you frame the question is hard for me, because one of the things that I came out of the National Broadband Plan thinking about, and again, let's go to the access, adoption, and utilization.
Sure.
Access, in a lot of ways, has to be a federal problem, partly because it involves spectrum, which is very much a federal issue, but also because only the federal government can make the kind of payments that are necessary to get networks everywhere. And just like with electricity and some other things, I do believe as a nation, it's part of the nation building thing, we ought to spend the money necessary to connect everybody. But adoption, what you see is it's a community by community thing. And there's got to be community leadership. And then on the utilization, we're talking about healthcare, education, job training, government services. It's really at the local level. And you, yesterday, we're talking to Deb Sosha, who started an organization called Next Century Cities. I recall one of the things she did was she organized dozens of mayors to talk about the importance of reforming Lifeline, which is the program that serves low-income individuals to get on broadband. And the point they made, and it's a really important point, is local governments benefit so enormously if everyone's on. You know, most enterprises these days only work on the digital platform. If you want to apply for a job to a Fortune 500 company, you're doing it online. If you want to work with most companies, you're doing it online. Government is kind of, they're almost the last, not quite the last. Dry cleaners would also be there, but the government is like the last institution, the last big enterprise that has to operate on both a digital and analog platform. Right. It's much more expensive, it's much less efficient, and you don't get the kind of, you know, one of the things that's really incredible about the 4 companies that testified today at the antitrust hearing, and you can argue about the antitrust implications, but one thing that's really interesting about these 4 companies, they always are learning. They are a different company today than they were 2 years ago. Government at its best should be the same. It should be learning, but it's a lot easier to do that on a digital platform, but government has to serve everybody. So in order to be as effective as it should be, you really need to get everybody on. So I would say there's hope on the national level, but not today. But though there's a much bigger constituency on broadband issues than there was when I was doing the National Broadband Plan. But boy, local levels, local efforts and state efforts, really critically important.
Yeah, I mean, looking at what small communities can do on a one-off basis. For example, Sandy, Oregon created their own fiber network. I think they pay $40 a month for gigabyte speeds. I mean, it's just out of this world. But the idea that every community can do that is a little tougher to think about. And I guess one potentially softball for you would be, what about the folks who say, hey, we don't need the feds. We actually have companies like Google and SpaceX that are going to, Loon and SpaceX that are going to be blasting broadband from space. Why do we need to wait?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a question that you should ask before that, which is, what's the nature of the broadband you want everyone to get, and what do you mean by everyone? There are some who think the answer to that question is everyone is 100%, and broadband is um, fiber. So it's gigabit capable. Well, it turns out if you look at the cost curves, somebody did, a very, very bright guy, did a memo in 2017 as the Obama administration was leaving that said it would cost $80 billion to connect the last 14% of the homes. So to go from 86% to 100% fiber capable homes. 40 billion of that is going from 86 to 98. The other 40 is going the last 2%. And by the way, I don't know this for sure, but I think like going from 98 to 99 is like 10 billion. And then the last 1% is like 30 billion.
Oh, geez.
Okay. That's the way the cost curve goes.
Right.
So if you want to spend more money connecting a home to fiber than the value of the home someplace in some rural area, you know, make the choice, but make it consciously.
Sure.
I think SpaceX has some really great potential to kind of address that last part. But that's a policy decision that, you know, people should consciously make. Everybody talks about connecting everyone. We don't connect everyone to telephone. We don't connect everyone to television. We don't connect everyone to water and sewer. I mean, you know, it's like,
right.
But I'm in favor of connecting everyone. But I am saying, particularly when, you know, it's something that strikes me as very problematic. If you're talking about spending $50,000 to connect a home to a fiber,
right,
but you're not willing to spend $500 to connect a family in urban America to make it affordable for them, you know, that
sure.
There's something that strikes me as wrong about that.
Yeah, I would venture to guess that if I applied my little public policy frameworks, courtesy of the Harvard Kennedy School, we would come out in favor of that $500 for the urban constituents. But like you said, it's a policy decision, and it's one that's not easy necessarily, especially if you're grounded in the principle of everyone having access.
That's right. That's right.
But I wonder.
But, I mean, I at least be conscious about the choices that you're making and about how you're spending the money.
Right. So for folks who are saying, all right, well, if the U.S. isn't doing it well, who is? What are the countries or what are the jurisdictions that you would point out as really doing innovative good work to close the digital divide?
Well, you know, the gold standard in a lot of broadband is South Korea. They've been ahead of us for some time. But I hesitate to say that because there are very significant differences between the United States and pretty much everybody else. But the biggest difference being we got cable early. Cable was originally, by the way, a rural phenomenon to broadcast television channels. Long, complicated story, but the point is, by the time that satellite television came along in the early 90s, or really the 80s, we had 2 wires into most homes. And that meant that we had some people say it's a monopoly. It's not a monopoly. There are 2 wires. Like everything else, depends on how you define the product market. But Europe, for example, got satellite television before they got cable, meaning cable only gets to 20 or 30% in a lot of areas, meaning that they had to regulate the telephone networks to be very, very different. So, you know, each country is a little bit different, but because of that difference, we have greater cable penetration than most countries, and that makes us different. But the thing that, you know, Korea is really an impressive country in a lot of ways. But the thing that struck me about Korea, the single most important was not anything they did, it's the process they do it by. So they had a national broadband plan, and they're constantly redoing it and constantly thinking about it. Ours was 10 years ago. I would argue we accomplished some really great things, but there should have been another one, you know, 2 years later, 5 years later.
Right.
There should be another one now. You know, it's an understanding that, and every business understands this, you don't win the day and declare victory and go away.
Right.
You know, you just got to keep learning, and you make a decision, and you then evaluate it later, and you see how you did, and you try to make it better. So hopefully we'll actually try to get smart.
Well,
but the present direction is not good.
Right. So going off of that idea of what would be smart, if we made you, Blair, benevolent dictator of the day, what's the
Yeah, I would turn it
first?
down, but go ahead.
All
I'm,
right,
I'm
so
opposed to kings.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
so,
right. We've removed the flammable objects.
yeah.
What is the kind of big policy wand you would wave? The biggest thing you think you could get done in one fell swoop by changing a couple
Well,
of things?
I actually think I'm going to say there are two really important related things. The biggest and most important thing is we need to, as a country, establish a digital inclusion and equity agenda. When we did the National Broadband Plan, there were a couple of things which we believed that turned out not to be so true. But I think they were common perceptions at that time. And there were reasons to think it. One of them I've already mentioned, which is it was going to be great and connected.
Yeah.
But the reason for that is technology scales so wonderfully. Okay, so
Right.
this is my phone. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure Jeff Bezos has the same phone.
Yeah.
He's
Right.
1,000 times richer than me or whatever. But it's the same phone, okay? I did a project for the UN on refugees. Those are probably the poorest, most resource-strapped people in the world. They don't have this phone, but they have a phone that's 60% as good. And let's pretend I'm 1,000 times richer than all of them, right?
Yeah.
My point is, they have a phone that's 60% as good as the guy who is, 1,000,000 times richer than them, more than that.
Right.
So that's actually pretty good. And when I go click onto a website, it's probably the same one Bezos uses, and it's the same one that, refugees in camps in Jordan use.
Right.
So there's the ability so that the best for one is available to all. And that's an incredibly powerful thing. So we thought the technology would move in the direction of bridging divides.
Sure.
It didn't. It didn't improve educational outcomes. It didn't improve healthcare outcomes. We need to be more conscious about how we bridge those divides. So that's one thing. But the second thing is the system that we have in the United States for funding universal service has a cancer.
Yeah.
It's going to blow up. And nobody wants to talk about it. And, we talked about it in the plan, but the politics are tricky. Solving it is tricky. But we need to really rethink that. So it would be a combination. You can't get to that digital agenda unless everybody's connected. That's like,
right.
That's in Maslow's hierarchy, the first thing. You got to get the networks everywhere. Then you got to get everybody on them. And then you can start to really have an agenda that improves all of the public services. But the things that fund those first two, that has a serious problem. We need to address it. This FCC, the current FCC, has not done anything about that because they're, I guess, hoping that it'll be solved by the next person. But to be fair to them, others have kicked it down the road as well.
Sure. Well, we will kick this conversation down the road to another time, hopefully to be continued. But Blair, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a blast on my end.
Well, a blast on mine as well. Good luck. Give my best to Evan and keep in touch.
Will do.
Thanks. Bye-bye.